Hello, welcome to our session today on stress. We've called it the Stress Bucket. I'm Mandy from I Listen, and I'm also joined today by Gareth.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon.
So in today's session, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what causes stress, what actually happens to us when we feel stressed, and then we're going to talk through a few tips and techniques that you might be able to use if you're feeling stressed and if you want to manage your stress levels or even prevent stress. So what we're going to cover in today's session, and this will last around about 15 minutes or so. We're going to talk about what stress is. We're going to look at what helpful stress might look like versus unhelpful stress. We'll have a look at the common triggers for stress, the sorts of things that might cause stress for us. We'll understand what the physical changes are to our chemistry in our brain, and also beyond that when we're under stress. And we want to look at a different way you can look at your stress to achieve a balanced approach and also build your resilience at the same time. So starting off, I'm going to ask the question, this is a rhetorical question, but I'm going to ask it to everybody who is joining us today. And I'm going to ask you as well, Gareth. Is this what stress looks like to you? Does this person look stressed?
He absolutely looks like he's under a lot of pressure. Yeah, I'd say he's definitely stressed at the moment.
Head in hand. He doesn't look too happy, mouth downturned. We can't actually see his eyes, but he certainly doesn't look too happy.
Yeah.
Is this what stress feels like to us? Sometimes we might feel as if we are absolutely on the edge. This lady definitely does.
Setting up different webinars and different platforms, I've definitely felt like that over the last few days.
Yeah, that could be very stressful for us, can't it? And we can feel that we're tearing our hair out a bit at technology, as this lady is here too. So let me ask you in a bit more of a defined way then. What do we actually think stress is? And I've got 5 options for you for those who are joining along at home. Just have a think about which of these different statements here you believe really defines what stress is. So we've got 4 different options, and then the 5th option is it all of those different things those different statements that we've shared with you today?
Yeah, I can see I can see truths in all of those, to be honest. So I would definitely say, yeah, all of the above would be my one. It's definitely physical and emotional tension, and it's a natural response. So my choice would be number 5.
Yeah, that's the right one. In fact, these are all definitions that are shared by different bodies, including the Health and Safety Executive, psychologists and experts who are looking after people with stress. So these are all correct. These are all different definitions that are correct and define stress for us. It's interesting that you say you picked up on it's a natural response to any kind of threat, and we'll certainly look at that in a little bit more detail. It's also an adverse reaction that people have to excessive pressure or demands, and that pressure word is certainly used by the HSC and their definition. It's the body's reaction to harmful situations. I think I'd add in there perceived harmful situations, things that for whatever reason we believe might do us harm. And that's quite an interesting way to look at it too, because we all have our unique perspective on the world, and for some people, a situation might seem harmful and might be stressful, and for other people it might not be so. So we all have our unique perception of the world around us, and what we perceive as harm might not necessarily be the same as somebody who's standing next to us. And it's also that physical, emotional and mental strain or tension that we all experience from time to time. Because stress is absolutely universal. It's something that we will all experience at some time. And some of us might be dealing with that right now, particularly with the situation that we're in with coronavirus at the moment. All right, Gareth, so what do you think? Is stress, given all of those definitions that we've just looked at, good for you, bad for you, or is it a bit of both?
Well, luckily I do know the answer to this one. So it's definitely a bit of both. We do need stress in our lives to be able to get out of bed, get the alarm clock going, get our bodies up, ready for the day ahead. So yeah, absolutely a bit of both.
Yeah, absolutely. We do need that bit of stress, that bit of pressure. And the picture that we've shared for you on the screen here is of an athlete getting ready for the race. They need that little bit of stress and challenge to get all of those different chemicals pumping into our system to enable us to get up and go and to perform at our absolute best. So yes, stress can be good for us. It can also be harmful. So you're right, it can be a bit of both things. We want to share with you this tried and tested model, the Yerkes-Dodson law. It's been around for a long time now, 1908, but I think it's absolutely one that has stood the test of time because it describes very well the different states of stress that we might experience.
Yeah,
So the optimal bit is the middle bit, isn't it?
yeah. When we were talking about is stress good or bad, do we need it? Then this, I mean, it's been around since 1908, so it really is a model that's stood the test of time. But it explains really that to get the best out of our performance, we need to be looking for that middle bit, the bit of eustress, which is good stress. That's the stuff that we're trying to harness to make our performances the best that we can. And we need a little bit of stretch to get us into that zone. Equally, if we didn't have that stretch, would be in the first part with the calm, and that can actually just be as harmful as being in the other side of it, distress, because we don't have any challenge. I think the best way is my first job, I worked at a company called InCoop, and I sorted bottles. That's what I did, different coloured green bottles, brown bottles, clear bottles, and I had to put them into different. And that was 7 hours of doing a monotonous work, and absolutely it got stressful because there was just no stretch, there's no challenge. It was just monotonous work, and I didn't get the best out of my performance. And I didn't I didn't feel accomplished at the end of the day. So we absolutely need that middle part. Interestingly, though, if we have too much going on in our lives, we can absolutely go down the other side of that curve and go into the distress part. And that's what we want to avoid, really. This is where multiple things can be happening. And we think of our current situation, everybody being in lockdown, away from work, isolated from colleagues, family members, friends. Maybe we're juggling different things. We've got family around and we've got to try and look after our diet because we know that that's good. Expectations of other things. You see how other people are doing things on Facebook and you think that's what my life should be like. If you're adding all these different pressures on top of you, and then you quickly slip down into this fatigue, exhaustion, and it starts to affect your health as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably traditionally what we think of when we think of stress. It's that distress that we're thinking of, that naturally pops into mind, that harmful stress, that stress that can damage our health and lead to mental health issues as well, such as depression, anxiety, even burnout. But actually, there are different stages in stress. So it's good to acknowledge that a certain amount of stress is good for us. As you quite rightly said, being on the other side of that curve can equally be stressful. We've all probably had jobs or times in our lives where we've been clock watching, waiting for the day to end. And that can be very stressful if we don't have sufficient kind of stress, interest, and feel that we're valued and doing valued work as well. All of those things can be stressful too.
I think it's interesting to note that the health and safety executive, they classify stress as a different word. They put it pressure. So they explain that you need to have pressure to be at your peak performance. And we're coming from it from a psychological point of view, but it's exactly the same in this scenario. If you're adding pressures onto you and multiple pressures, especially in this tricky time that we're facing, then you can see how that can take us down into that distress zone that we want to avoid.
So as Gareth said, maybe we are currently feeling stress. We are in a stressful situation. Not everybody will be, but there will be times in everybody's life where we do feel stress. So really kind of altering perhaps the way that we think about stress can be the first step to dealing with that. So we've actually said here that some stress can be helpful. We saw that in our last model. The Yerkes-Dodson law says that eustress, the bit in the middle, is actually helpful. It's good for us. But even when we tip over into that distress part of the model, some of that can be helpful for us. It can be something that forces us almost to change our perspective. So the first step I would say is to acknowledge that you're feeling stressed. So if you are feeling that way, often we kind of ignore it or we set it to one side. We might even perceive it as some sort of weakness if we acknowledge it. So if we come out with it, we talk about it, we share that with our family member that we're with, a colleague, a friend, and we acknowledge that, yes, we are stressed. That's the first step in dealing with that. And that might be something that we do because we're aware of different changes in our behavior or physical changes. And we'll have a look at what those might look like a little bit later on. So the second step is to actually own our stress, to actually take that on board and say, yes, this is my stress, and I'm feeling stress because of, and think about how you would complete that sentence. Normally we feel stressed about something because we care deeply about it. We care about it. It's important to us. So, for example, we might be feeling stressed because we can't do our job the way that we ordinarily would. And we're feeling stressed about it because that's important to us. We feel value from the job that we do and from being able to do a good job. Or
Absolutely.
we might be feeling stressed because we can't see extended family members at the moment, or friends, people who are close to us. And so acknowledging that we feel that stress because something is happening that is altering our situation, is preventing us from doing something, and it's affecting something that's important to us. So acknowledging that and really drawing it back to our values and principles can help us to really understand why we're feeling stressed, and that's helpful too.
I think it's important to think that we're really stretching our basic needs at the moment. So our air, our water, our food, our exercise routine, all of these things are being restricted, and that's adding to our stress levels as well. So it's particularly important to own those as well. Realize that yes, something is out of the norm, something is not quite as normal as it should be. We need to acknowledge that, and then also put plans into action to say, okay, so how do I manage that at this point? Because this is happening to everybody, of course, and it is only a temporary period of time. It might seem like this is going to be a forever thing, but no matter if it lasts over to a year, in our life plan, that's only a temporary dip that we're going through.
So the third step is to use your stress, because we've said we've stress, we've tried to understand why we're stressed, we've linked it back to what's important to us, and the third step is to use that stress in a useful way for us, and it's to say, because this is important to me and I am going to do something about it. So use that stress to make a plan, as Gareth said.
So this is a really interesting model that puts into perspective some of the things that we're facing at the moment. It's the Holmes Ray scale, and this is an abridged version. The larger version gives a lot more detail and some information really on things that we're facing at the moment with lockdown as well. And the reason we added this onto it, if you can imagine that Yerkes-Dodson law, where we're going through the eustress that we're trying to achieve, and then how it can be tipped over. These life events are all things that can tip us over the edge, shall we say, that can make a real difference. So if COVID-19 is not on here at the moment, but we would imagine that if somebody was to put a life-changing units on it, point system, then it would be quite high. It'd be up there near the 73, if not 100. Now, why is that important? Well, what this life events chart looks at is the different things that affect us throughout life, and what they try to do is put a point system on it. So their measuring tools say that if we have over 300 points over a year period, then our mental health is more likely to be affected, and we'll go into that distress zone. Now, if you look at these things that are going on at the moment, the pressures that we're under as well from work, working from home, family working alongside us, maybe we've got children that we've got to take care of as well, then you can see how these point systems quickly add up in a short period of time, never mind a year. So maybe we're feeling that there's a threat that our job's under under review at this stage. Maybe we know that there's quite a lot of people being furloughed or even redundancies being made. Maybe it's a concern about having to pay the mortgage, something really simple like that. Maybe it's having difficulties at home. Maybe everybody's relationship being in that confined space is being tested, and not everybody is going to be able to come out of that well. These are all things that we've got to have in the back of our mind when we're talking about ownership and realizing how this affects us. This really is the type of thing that we need to consider.
Yeah, I think, you know, at the moment we can see how the points would tot up really easily. And because of all of the various pressures that are put on us from all sorts of different angles, as you said, whether it's relationship or financial, whether it's living conditions, whether it's even just right back down to the basics of being able to get food. You know, we know there was a lot of panic buying at the beginning of this, and it may have slowed down a little bit now, but certainly things that are very different these days. So all of those changes in very quick succession would very soon add up. I think, you know, sort of looking at this in the longer term, it's quite interesting from your own perspective, and perhaps for looking at people around you, whether that's colleagues or family members or friends, just to have an awareness in the back of your mind that if you go through one of these big life events, actually it can adversely impact your mental health. And we say can, we use that in an advised way. You know, we're not saying that everybody will, and that magic number 300 means you absolutely 100% will fall ill, but it certainly increases the likelihood. So it's something just to have an awareness of. Such an interesting scale. So certainly, you know, have a look up. It's on the internet. There's actually also a separate version for children. So there is a different one that has different points and different events on it for children too. So worth having a look.
I think it's worth going back to the point that you made earlier, Mandy, when you say it could be perceived threat as well. When we're talking about change in health of a family member, that's quite high, 44 points just for that. The perceived threat of that happening as well, especially in this time, could also add to that worries. I put it personally that we've got quite an elderly mother, and she's at home isolated, well away from the rest of the family, but there is a perceived threat that if we went there, we could be putting her in danger. So that's one of the things that we need to consider as well, that it doesn't actually have to be somebody who is ill. It could be that perceived that we could make them ill, especially in when we're talking about coronavirus at the moment. So what is actually happening then? There is a physical thing that happens when we feel under threat, when we're feeling that we can't cope with things. It harks back to when we were very early man. What we were designed to do is survive. We were built in with this flight, fight, freeze response. And what that does is prepares us for danger. So if I'm getting chased down the street by a lion, for example, my fight, fight, freeze response will kick in, and I can turn around, punch the lion in the nose if I think that's the best option for me. I can run away as fast as I can, or I can freeze and hope that the lion has spotted something else, not me, it's not me it's chasing, and goes after that other thing. That's been with us for early days. We're animals, it's how we deal with different things. And what actually happens physically is that we release two chemicals. There's adrenaline and cortisol, and it pumps into our system to get us ready to be able to deal with that response. Now, as we've adapted over years, and even faster in the last few decades, with technology going further and further, we are adapting a little bit differently. However, the fight, fight, freeze response is still there. That's still key. It's our instincts. We can't change that. So that if we're running down the street, going for a run, that adrenaline is building up inside us. It's preparing us to do that. As the same way it would be as we were early man running away from a lion, which is not really necessary because we don't really have many lions running around the street nowadays. But it's triggered in our system, and it's something that happens every time that we're faced with threats or a perceived threat, and we're going back to that stress level. It can tip us over. So what actually happens is that in the middle of the screen here, you'll see a neuron, and this is in our brain. We've got 86 billion of them, and it's how we transfer information from one to another. They go down these spindly things here that we can see called axons and dendrites. And at the very end of those, there's a little gap called the synapse, and electrical pulses pass from one to the other, and it's how we do absolutely everything. It's how we move our hands, it's how we blink our eyes, it's how we walk up, make breakfast, know we're hungry. Absolutely everything is controlled by this. Now, when we're put in a position of danger, our fight, flight, freeze response kicks in, and these chemicals are released. Cortisol, also known as the stress hormone, enters our system, and what it actually does is starts attacking our brain. It's like bringing out a steak from the fridge and put it in a hot frying pan. So it contracts really fast. And what it does is makes that gap between the synapse from a manageable piece where the information is going across to further and further and further, so that that information doesn't pass across as it should do. Now, what does that look like? Mandy, I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever gone into a room and thought, what did I come in here for?
Yeah, it happens all the time. And funny enough, particularly when I'm stressed.
Yeah, so that's actually a physical reaction to what's happening. It means that information isn't going down the axons and dendrites as it should do, and it means that the information isn't getting passed across. Now, of course, we're very adaptable human beings, so that information will travel down another route and go to another neuron, and eventually 3 hours later we'll go, bing, that's why I went into that room, and you'll remember. But from that physical reaction that's actually happening to us through the stress hormone, we can actually put it down to a lot of things that we face when we're stressed. When we're thinking of confused thinking, maybe gaps in our memory, what's happening, and our worry about that affects things like sleep patterns as well. Constantly thinking, what's going on? Why did I do that? And therefore, it's impossible to go to our sleep because these neurons are working overtime to try and get that information to the correct part.
Yeah, absolutely. I can recognize that, you know, if you have a particularly stressful morning, trying to get up, you maybe woken up a little bit late, you're rushing to get yourself ready, get yourself fed, get the family fed, get out of the door, maybe you've hit bad traffic and so on. You can feel that stress building in you. So it doesn't even have to be one of those situations where, you know, it's life threatening now, you know, the sort of lion chasing you down the street sort of scenario, and actually be these little sort of daily things that we have to deal with all fire off these hormones. And you can see why you might then get into work and think, do you know what, I just can't think straight today. I mean, it's a phrase that we use all the time, isn't it? And it is that kind of fuzzy thinking that results from that means that we are kind of struggling to process things. And over time, that kind of compound effect, you know, particularly when we go back to the Holmes and Ray scale that we looked at, if we're having lots of those big events happening, we're constantly under attack from this cortisol, and that has that compound effect, and that can really over time impact things like our mood, our anxiety levels and so on, harmful over the longer term.
Absolutely, and it really does tie into how that would affect our mood if we're not getting proper sleep, if we're worrying about things that would turn into anxiety if left untreated as well. It has a real negative effect, and not understanding that it's a natural physical thing that's happening to us can make things really, really bad. So if we think about all these demands and stresses that we're facing, we all have a capacity, and every single person has a different capacity of what we can deal with. And this is what we call the stress bucket. So it's our ability to cope with situations we're faced. And we think about our current situation with COVID-19, the lockdown, maybe it's looking after kids, maybe it's sharing space with family members, maybe it's pressures from work to get our job done in an allotted time. All these things are demands and stresses that we're trying to deal with. And we all have an ability to cope with that, which is fine. Now, naturally, we have ways of counteracting that. We can give ourselves good chemicals to be able to balance it out. We can do things like look after our diet. We can do exercise, all these different things triggering the good chemicals that we're looking for to have that balance. But what if we're in a situation at the moment where our exercise is limited? Maybe we're not getting the food that we need to get. maybe our social interaction has been restricted because we're not allowed to talk to people. Well, what actually happens is that this stress bucket gets higher and higher and fuller of all the pressures that we're putting under ourselves, to a point that it'll actually can break. And when it breaks, what would you think it comes out like, Mandy? How do you think that would look like to me and you?
So I think a lot of anxiety and worry and even kind of despair, even sort of really struggling to cope with the situation you're in, and even maybe something like a panic attack, perhaps.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the traditionally the panic attack moment. It's when things get too much, the sides break, we can't deal with anything more, everything becomes overwhelming. In fact, the panic attack, when this stress bucket overloads, it's a catastrophic misunderstanding of the flight, flight, freeze response. It's not understanding what we're going with, how we're dealing with it, and it's just becomes too much and everything comes out at once. So yeah, short breathing, panic attacks are absolutely something that we would see at this stage.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question now of you all who are joining us today, and ask, how do you show your stress? Just have a think for a moment about what it is that other people around you might see and experience when you're stressed. Really kind of think back recent experience of feeling stressed. And as we said, you know, we're all going through a really tricky time at the moment. So it would be unusual if we weren't feeling stressed at the moment. But think about something very recently for you that caused you to feel stressed. What would other people around you see and experience? Gareth, what would they see? What would people in your household see?
I think if they saw me, I have a tendency to talk really fast when I'm under pressure. I feel like I've got to blurt absolutely everything out. Equally, I've got a nice warning sign. I have psoriasis, so that gives me a preempt. My skin comes out to say, okay, something's not quite right here. So I'm able to deal with different things. What about you? Do you have anything?
Yeah, I think I definitely have a tendency to be a bit withdrawn and go a little bit quiet, a bit into myself, into my own head, and probably not engage with people as much as I ordinarily would. Definitely tension. I always feel tension in my shoulders.
Yeah.
So I definitely know that when I'm feeling really sort of tense and stressed, it's going to show there. And like you know, I feel a little bit run down. I'm maybe a bit more prone to things like, you know, coughs and colds and stuff like that, the usual sort of sore throats and things. So there definitely is, like you, a link with my general health. And we know that those chemicals, of course, that attack our brain over the longer term do impact our immunity as well. Our immune system is
Absolutely,
under
yeah.
attack. So it's no wonder that we start to feel some of these physical things as well. So very, very interesting to think about what your warning signs are. As Gareth said, he's got an early warning sign. He looks at his skin and thinks, oh, something's not quite right here. I'm not maybe coping as well as I thought I would. Or maybe it is something to do with your mood or your behaviours as well. But just think about that in yourself and think about it in the people around you too, because we'll all probably react in slightly different ways. And when we think about the signs of stress, there are different ways that we could think of it, starting with the internal bit, the bit that's in our head, our emotional state and how I feel. And there's all sorts of different things that we might feel when we start to feel stressed. So it's worth sort of tuning into these feelings and really paying attention to them, because as we said earlier on, ignoring them is not a good strategy. We know the impact that cortisol has over the long term. If we don't deal with it, it is harmful. So it is absolutely something we should really lean into and pay attention to. There's all sorts of things on our list here, ranging from feeling irritable, a bit wound up or impatient. It could be even that your thoughts are racing and your mind can't switch off. We probably often experience that, and then we know that can impact your sleep as well. Unable to switch off at night when I go to bed, my brain is still racing, for example. Unable to take enjoyment in things that we ordinarily would find enjoyable in life. So those just don't have the same sort of level of enjoyment for us anymore. and we might just feel generally a bit uninterested in things, whether that's a TV program we normally like, whether it's an activity, whatever it might be. We just kind of disengage from that a little bit, and we might feel like we've lost our sense of humor. We're just not really finding things funny at the moment. So all sorts of different things that we might internally feel ourselves that people are not necessarily aware of or able to see.
The one that we didn't mention there was depressed. Now, this is an interesting one, because we know that depression is a long-term condition. It's something that's been going for a long time. And it's what we prefer to be called or what we prefer to call it, I should say, is low mood. And low mood left untreated is depression. However, we know equally that people use terms now that I'm feeling so depressed, I'm so anxious about something. So there is a different things. Having anxiety and being anxious is quite a big statement. You're quite far down the line if you have anxiety, but you can be worried about things. You can have concern about things, and that's the start. This is where we really think we can get the best success by acting early on, which I think is really important, because this whole session here is built around looking after somebody at that early stages. So worry, concern, if somebody's not quite right, we can do something about by doing this. And equally, worry, left untreated, when it goes to depression, that's when you need to be taking the next step and actually seeing a medical professional.
Absolutely. You're quite right. The earlier that we can really pay attention to these signs and do something about it, the better results we're going to have. And it is something that we can have control over, we can do something about. So those are the internal signs, the things that we feel within ourselves. But of course, our thoughts and our feelings do impact our behaviours, and that's the bit that other people around us might have an awareness of. So the sorts of things that you might see either in yourself or somebody around you as they're feeling stress, they might be finding it hard to make decisions or really achieve or accomplish things that they ordinarily would be able to. And we know that kind of links back to that fuzzy thinking we were talking about as the cortisol does its damage. Or we might see it in that worrying. So somebody's constantly talking about things, ruminating, going over and over things, almost stuck in a bit of a loop about worrying about things. They don't seem to be able to get out of that. People might be avoidant as well, so they might shy away from engaging with things that they ordinarily would have done, whether that's talking to somebody or getting involved in an activity. It might be those little habits, like nervous habits like picking at your skin or you're biting your nails, those kind of little things, fidgety things that we all sort of do when we're feeling on edge, when we're feeling that kind of pressure and it's starting to tip over into that distress. It might also impact things like our eating habits or our dependency on things like smoking or drinking. So we start to rely on things, crutches that we think might alleviate the symptoms of stress. So we're looking for those kind of comforting things around us too.
Absolutely. I think dependencies is something that in this particular period, you'll see quite a lot of people who are looking for ways of coping with different things. Maybe if they're struggling to sleep, for example, after a couple of glasses of wine, they get to sleep earlier. Which is fine, and once or twice, of course, we're talking about balance, and that's fine. But when it becomes every night trying to get to sleep, the only way I can do it is by having a glass of wine. You can see how dependency becomes linked with mental health quite a lot.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that we naturally look for ways to alleviate the stress, and sometimes unfortunately we make the wrong decisions about what might help us to do that, and we make the wrong choices. And certainly alcohol, comfort eating and things like that, whilst perfectly understandable, are probably not the best way to actually deal with that stress. So what about physical health? And we touched on that earlier on because I talked about muscle tension, which is on our list here. Gareth talked about his skin conditions. We also know other physical signs of stress, stomach problems, digestion problems, things like heartburn or even irritable bowel syndrome. Those kind of things tend to flare up if somebody is feeling stressed. So if you do have a health condition that you live with, you'll tend to know when you're feeling stressed because these things tend to be exacerbated. But you might also get things like the sleep problems, feeling exhausted, really sort of low energy all of the time. You might even have things like headaches, um, sore eyes, feeling that kind of really sort of tired, those things that you link with tiredness. And ask yourself, is it really linked to tiredness, or is that a symptom of something that I'm dealing with or not dealing with, a stressful situation? It might be things around your breathing as well. So if you start to feel a little bit panicked by the situation, you might have somebody shallow breathing or even hyperventilating.
It ties in really well to the stress bucket that we were describing earlier, and the way that can quickly get built up so we have no control over it at all. So I think it's really important to get the balance in our life, to be able to do things, to be able to cope with this. Because if we just ignore everything, and if we think, yes, I can cope with it at the moment, so I'll be able to cope with it next week and the week after, without actually doing any of the good stuff to help us, we can see how that bucket can fill up to a point where it absolutely breaks. And then it gets to a point where you think you can't really understand why that's happening. Well, I've coped with it fine for the last month, so why is this suddenly happening? And that's the real problem, where you'll see panic attacks, the shallow breathing and hyperventilating coming through.
Yeah, and over the longer term as well, there are some really serious health and conditions that we know are very much linked to stress. So science has shown us things like high blood pressure, for example, and even heart conditions. Those sorts of things are the really serious end of stress that's left untreated over time. So it really is something that we need to take seriously. It's not just a fact of modern life. It's not something that we should just accept or ignore. It's absolutely something that we should take control of, we should manage, and we should deal with. Okay, so we've talked about how we might deal with our stress. Let's have a look at some steps to actually help us to manage that in a very active way. The first thing is to really understand the things that trigger your stress, to understand the kind of situations that you personally find stressful. And we look back at the Holmes and Ray scale, and we said that there are things that universally people find stressful, but our attitude to stress is very unique to us. The things that we perceive as stressful for us might not be stressful for somebody else, and vice versa. So understanding the things that typically trigger our stress is the first step in dealing with that. So the next thing is to address the triggers that you can. So once you've identified what triggers your stress, think about the things that you have some power over, some control over, the things that you can actually do something about. If we link this back to coronavirus at the moment, we know that there's a certain amount of things that we can do something about and some things that we just can't do anything about. So the disease itself, for example, the restrictions that are placed on us by our governments, for example, we can't actually do anything about those things. But what we can do is some of the things we can do something about, the things that we are dealing with because of those restrictions. So whether that's the lack of contact with family members, we know we can't physically go and see them, but we can do something about contacting them, whether that's by technology or even at the end of a garden, for example, nowadays, where we can actually perhaps see somebody at a safe distance, for example. So think about what we can do something about, what we can't do something about, and let go of the things that we can't change.
I think the addressing the triggers, that's equally with the right attitude. And I think if you're being positive about things and seeing them in the right way, so we're moving forward towards the end of all of this coming by doing it incrementally, and we have a better chance of being able to take control of it. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And the attitude that you choose to take, and it is a choice, it is something that we can make decisions about, is one of those things that is within our control to do something about. If we kind of readdress how we view things, the perception that we have of something, then it can feel like it's no longer a trigger, for example. Okay, because I've changed my view of it, definitely. And then finally, once we've addressed what the triggers might be and we've decided to do something about the things that we can control, that we do have power, or to do something about our attitude towards it, as you say, and we decided to let go of the things that we can't change, we don't have control over, then set some smart goals and make a plan about what you're going to actually do to manage those stress levels. Now, we know that there are some influences on resilience, and we've got a few listed here.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of other courses that we've done on resilience, so we won't go into too much detail, but if you want to look at those, they're available on our YouTube channel, I Listen. But we know that having good support from family and close friends is vital at this time. If we're talking about one of the great things to boost good chemicals, to do some of that counteractive work that or repair work on our neurons, we need to be able to have close relationships with family, work colleagues, anybody who you can share what you're going through with, really. It's very tricky at this time, I think, with being in lockdown and not seeing as many people, but this is where technology has really come into the forefront, I think.
Yeah, definitely. You know, and using apps like Zoom, FaceTime, WhatsApp, all these different things are thankfully enabling us to stay connected. And, you know, although it's not the same as being, you know, in the same room as somebody, being face to face, it's not a bad substitute. And it's certainly a way of us being able to connect with other people. And as you say, you know, that releases those good chemicals, it does that repair work. And being able to talk about the situation that we're in, talk about, you know, how we're feeling is absolutely going to boost some of those good chemicals for us.
Absolutely. And then moving on to work, we go back to the Yerkes-Dodson law that's been with us for many years, of course. And we know that we need that stretch as well to be able to get into that eustress zone. So work really comes into that. Being able to do your job the best that you can, to be able to challenge yourself is something that we absolutely need. Otherwise, we're stuck in that bored zone, which we want to avoid at all costs, really. And so having stretch at work, being able to have a space in your house, maybe it's a corridor like I'm in here at the moment, maybe it's a bedroom, making that as comfortable as possible to get your work done, to be able to get a plan of action, to be able to do your job, and maybe all the other things that are going on around us as well. Maybe it's putting a plan for the kids to keep them busy while you're doing your work. And it's really going to be a boost to our resilience factors.
And even if you don't have a job in the traditional sense, we know that volunteering, for example, is a great way of feeling that sense of reward, that sense of purpose that you get from work. It's the same sort of feeling that you get from that. So in whatever way works for you, finding that kind of purpose, that goal, that reason to get up out of bed in the morning really does impact us, that bit of resilience.
Yeah, and then personal resources, things that we can do to stretch ourselves, things that we can do to build our resilience. So maybe it's, as Mandy's mentioned, Joe Wicks, I think earlier, doing a workout, yeah, or on YouTube. Maybe it's taking the proactive choice to, come on, let's do something for an hour in the morning, get a little bit of the blood going, get that little bit of eustress, and to get us in our peak performance rate. Maybe it's looking after our diet. So I'm going to cook a nice healthy meal today at lunchtime, or maybe everybody seems to be baking bread at the moment. That seems to be a good resource to do. Or maybe it's reaching out to a family member or friend and saying, do you know what, I'm struggling at the moment and I could probably need some help. Knowing that there's things around you to support you through a tricky time would really help you boost your resilience.
Yeah, and that extends to, you know, your finances and so on as well, and kind of taking charge of that and making a plan for how you're going to deal with those finances. You know, even if you're, you know, not struggling at the moment, you know, looking forward and having that kind of resource around you as well to support yourself. Looking at options if you are struggling, if you're not sort of working at the moment, looking at the options that are provided by government, and there's all sorts of resources as well provided by charities in the third sector. So it's just exploring what those resources are that you know can support your well-being, your resilience.
It's the other thing you can do is build your skill sets as well, and it's not all about work. If you've got an opportunity to better yourself at work, then absolutely we would say to encourage doing something like that is going to help you get through this tricky period. But maybe it's as we mentioned, taking up some baking. Maybe it's spending the time with the children that we have. It's coming up with different games, different ideas that we can do. There's so many resources online at the moment that are helping us boost our skills. And even when we move into learning and education, again, lots of things that have been made available for free for us. In fact, myself and Mandy are both doing different courses at the moment, but it's through something called Future Learn. And it's a great free resource, and we're really taking the opportunity at the moment to make the most of that, because we know that that's given us that stretch and challenge.
Yeah, it's such an important thing. We know that learning a new skill is absolutely vital for our well-being. You know, if you're feeling stressed, it's such a hopeful, forward-thinking thing to do, is to learn something new, and whether that's, as you say, something to do with your job or education, or whether it's just learning to garden, bake, or, you know, take a new exercise class and learn a new skill that way. There's all sorts of things out there, and so many things for free as well. And that it's a great time to try something new.
Absolutely. And final one on our list there, community and career networks. It's tricky at the moment as we're all working remotely. However, with apps around that, like similar to the one we're using today, it's not impossible. So I think it's really important to reach out, keep in contact with the community around you, know what's going on, see what other people are going through. Try not to be critical about yourself. If you're not doing as much as everybody else, then that's fine. It's just all about balance. And then your career networks, maybe it's looking for a mentor, a peer that can help you through a difficult time, a peer that can help you, encourage you to do different things that we mentioned above here, the learning and education, or maybe it's a new skill at work. It's really important to be able to realize that you're not in this alone.
Yeah, it is. And you use the word balance there, which I think is so important. And the reason we've got all of these things on here is because it is a balancing act between all of these different things. If you have all of these different facets in your life, all these different resources available to you, then all of these things together strengthen your resilience. And when you're you know, going through something tough, when you're stressed, then having these things around you will support you. And if you're not stressed at the moment, having these things around you build up the resilience to enable you to cope better when you are going through a stressful time too. So there are three things that we've kind of touched on briefly already, and we're just going to talk about these because they're so important. And science and numerous studies show us that these things will boost our sense of well-being. And whether we're feeling stressed now, as I said, or whether we're coping at the moment, but we all know that we will go through stressful times in our life. They're things that we should focus a bit of our energies on. And that's eating right, your diet, it's taking some exercise, and it's a bit of social interaction, which we talked a lot about so far. So I'm just going to go back to exercise, Gareth. What kind of exercise is really good for us in terms of our well-being?
Well, the best exercise that we can do to support our mental health, to actually build up resilience factors so we're prepared for things in the future, is not going down to the gym and working on the weights. It's doing natural exercise. So natural exercise, there's three forms that we would recommend, and that's swimming, cycling, and walking or light jogging. Now, swimming's probably out of it at the moment, unless you fancy going down to the bay and having a swim in the sea, which can be exhilarating. It really gets the stress levels up.
Yeah.
But cycling is absolutely one of the great things we can do on the Isle of Man anyway. And walking or light jogging equally are really good. What it does is it triggers a process called bilateral stimulation, which is moving thoughts from one side of your brain to another way. It's doing the natural repair work. And what we're talking about here is you don't have to do it for miles and miles and miles. It could be the fact that you've been looking at the computer all day and you just think, I just need 5 minutes. You go away, make a cup of coffee, and come back, and you usually feel refreshed. So that's just after a 5-minute thing. So having that ability to reset your clock, to be able to address things is so super important. Otherwise, I think when our mood is low and we're worried about things, we have a tendency to withdraw, to isolate and hide ourselves away, where in fact, doing these natural exercise methods is really, really important. Number one thing I could recommend doing is have a dog, because once you've got a dog and you're forced to go out, take it for a walk, and you're doing that anyway. Plus, dogs pass on one of the good chemicals that we talk about, which is called dopamine. Dopamine is really important to do some of that repair work. So when we go out with our dog, when we see our dog, it's very happy, joyful, and it usually picks our mood as well. So it's transferring on to us.
Yeah, and I think you're right. You know, if you are choosing to do some of the more high energy kind of exercise, that's fabulous too, because, you know, setting a goal for yourself to do that, just make sure that you balance it with some of the lower level things that Gareth talked about, the cycling and the walking. And if you can get out in the fresh air, we know that boosts your sense of well-being as well. We know that it releases chemicals that enable you to deal with that. So if you are feeling stressed, it's such a brilliant way to de-stress, I think, is exercise.
Absolutely. I
Briefly,
think the exercise that we've just got to be aware to avoid, or not avoid, but have in the back of our mind, is that if we're triggering the adrenaline rush, then we're also triggering that cortisol. They come hand in hand. You can't separate them. You can't do one without another. So if we are giving ourselves a boost of adrenaline, have in the back of our mind, yeah, I'm releasing cortisol as well. And there are ways, of course, that you can counterbalance this. Having a nice cold bath, maybe it's a massage of a partner or a loved one. Maybe it's a little bit of mindfulness or meditation. All of these things are going to help counterbalance it as well.
Yeah. Just really briefly on diet, we all know the benefits for our physical health of having a healthy and balanced diet, eating plenty of fresh fruit and vegetables. Also, we should think about, you know, diet in terms of cooking, in terms of preparing a meal, you know, in terms of making something from scratch. It's such a brilliant activity for our well-being as well. We know that it boosts our sense of well-being. We feel like we've accomplished something, and if we can do that with others around us that we're sharing our household with, then it gives us a bit of that social interaction too. So lots and lots of things that you can do around these three things here that you might in your plan for dealing with your stress, for managing your stress levels. So this is our session today. We've been through everything that we need to cover, and we've done our whistle-stop tour of what stress is. We've looked at helpful stress, and there is such a thing, versus unhelpful stress. We've thought about the common triggers and Ray scale, and we've also said have a think about your own triggers for stress and what do you personally think triggers stress for you. We've also understood a little bit about our brain and the physical changes that we undergo, things that might damage our health when we're under stress. And we've thought about some ways that we might implement a balanced approach to developing our resilience and to doing something around our diet, exercise, and social interaction that will help look after our mental well-being and cope with that stress. And as we said, we've looked at our influences on our resilience and building ourselves up so that when we are dealing with stress, we're able to cope with it better. Okay, so this is a recorded session, so we don't have a Q&A. However, if you do have any questions and you want to reach out to us, please do so. We've included for you a couple of different email addresses here. If you want to ask us any questions, you want to know a little bit more about what we're doing, or how we might be able to support you or your organisation, then use the Training at iListen email address that we show on the screen. If you're interested in fundraising, volunteering, or want to know a bit more about our projects, then reach out to get involved at iListen. And as Gareth mentioned before, we have other videos available, different training sessions on our iListen YouTube channel. So, you know, please do take a look there and share with any family members, friends, colleagues who you think might benefit.
Absolutely. We are a local charity on the Isle of Man, and we do have a service that we provide as well, one-to-one, person-to-person service. We employ professor of psychology, CBT therapists, play therapists, you name it, and we're there to help people of the Isle of Man. So if you are struggling in any way, please do get in touch and we can try and help as much as we can. If it's not seeing one of our therapists, we will signpost you to the right person to see. So thank you very much for listening to us.
Thanks very much and stay safe, everybody.